okay if people reference you as able? Or is it science and race only?
I suppose able would be fine just to make it easy.
Okay, cool. Just want to make that clear.
Here's the resolution. The resolution is human races are substantially genetically different from each other, and among these genotypic racial differences is average intelligence.
Okay. So we're live. Thanks everyone for joining. It's a debate between Joe Sonseed and Science and Race, aka Abel. The resolution was just read by Abel. It'll be a debate in the format of about an hour, 10 minutes for each to give opening statements, starting with Abel, 30 or 40 minutes for discussion. That's not set in stone, and 5 minutes each to conclusions for concluding arguments. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for Ocean, who helped do the logistics and was just an all-around bro, who is currently stuck in traffic. Ocean, show us your traffic real quick.
Maybe traffic.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, Ocean is going to help.
I think I had the mobile boot, so I might be in and out.
All right. So, okay. So with that said, I will give it to the affirmative, which is Abel, and you can start whenever you like. Go ahead.
Okay, again, the affirmative is human races are substantially genetically different from each other, and among these genotypic racial differences is average intelligence. That's the resolution. It's scientific in nature, not political, and this scientific point can be used for a diverse range of political positions. A diversity of politics is represented among race realists. I'm a member of the alt-left, not the alt-right, and I claim this knowledge can and should be used for liberal ends, not for white nationalist ends. In this opening statement, I'll first present the most important argument. It is an argument that presents the related background knowledge, as the background knowledge is essential for judging the probability of any claim. I'll present arguments from direct evidence only in the upcoming rounds. I'll cite sources only after the opposition questions or challenges the factual accuracy of any of my claims, and I may put such citations in the chat box. So premise number one, general genotypic differences most certainly exist among individuals within any single race, i.e. height, skin color, eye color, lung size, genetic diseases, blood pressure, blood type, muscle mass, bone density, lactose tolerance, estrogen level, pathogen resistances, penis size, and brain size. When I say genotypic differences, I mean traits that are largely but not completely genetically heritable within groups. And we know this from heritability studies, including twin and adoption studies, like if you have identical twins raised in separate households, they still have a hell of a lot of things in common. And you can actually judge the portion of the heritability based on those twins. Among other family groupings. Premise number two, general genotypic differences most certainly exist among races on average or in frequency, i.e. height, skin color, eye color, lung size, genetic diseases, blood pressure, blood type, muscle mass, bone density, lactose tolerance, estrogen level, pathogen resistances, penis size, and brain size. And I can give citations for each of those. They are kind of indisputable genotypic differences. The difference between premise number one and premise number two is between individuals and races. The definition of races may be challenged. If need be, I'll define races according to Ernst Mayr's definition of geographic race in his 2004 article titled The Biology of Race and the Concepts of Equality as follows. Quotes, an aggregate of phenotypically similar populations of a species inhabiting a geographic subdivision of the range of that species and differing taxonomically from other populations of that species, unquote. Spectra of racial categories follows from the objective spectrum of evolution. And evolution is typically defined as change in allele frequency over time. Races are merely geographic subsets of species with allele frequencies varying from one another. From this, we know that races must necessarily have continuous boundaries with their geographic neighbors. Each race must be internally diverse, and it is no less true that there are significant differences among races with respect to the average or frequency of any given biological trait, just like there is a large objective difference between red and blue on a color spectrum, even if there is a continuum between the two colors. If my opponent is in any way unhappy with Mayer's definition of race, then I will probably allow my opponent to choose a definition that matches that of how he normally uses the word, even if he thinks races are only socially constructed, whatever that means. For example, I will accept the definition of races that he accepts if he rightly claims that there is common economic discrimination against some races more than against others. Even if races are only socially constructed, whatever that means, then the patterns of genotypic differences like I described still exist. And my other arguments will work just as effectively. The perceived problems with the definition of race, therefore, is not relevant. If my opponent challenges my definition, then I will probably let that challenge stand if he presents any common alternative definition of race that he prefers. If he prefers no alternative definition, then he either never uses the word race, or he prefers to use the word without meaning, or his tactic of challenging the definition is merely in the spirit of anti-rational postmodernist deconstructionism, and I prefer not to waste my time with that. Premise number 3. Psychological genotypic differences most certainly exist among individuals within any single race, i.e., intelligence, sexual promiscuity, personality type, and criminality. These points of heritability are less well known, but the intermediate within-group heritability of each of these traits is established beyond reasonable doubt by twin and adoption studies. I can give citations for each of these heritability claims when asked. Premise number 4. Psychological phenotypic differences most certainly exist on average or in frequency among races, i.e., intelligence, sexual promiscuity, personality type, and criminality. The key word on this point is phenotypic as opposed to genotypic, so I'm not assuming the resolution. Phenotypic differences are direct macroscopic observed differences that could be due to either genetic differences or environmental differences or both. Heritability studies can't directly test level of between-race heritability, only the level of within-race heritability. And finally, the conclusion. Therefore, the resolution that psychological genotypic differences exist among races on average or in frequency, i.e., intelligence, sexual promiscuity, personality type, and criminality, is highly plausible. I'll share an image that illustrates that point. Yeah, here we go. Albums. There it is. I hope you can see that.
Yeah, I've got it.
It's a 2x2.
Yeah, confirmed you're up.
2x2 grid, and the resolution would be that red X in the bottom right. And you have to ask yourself, how plausible is it that there would be a red X instead of another green check mark, especially given that the differential traits among races really are there. So what are the odds? If any position is more plausible than another position, then the burden of proof is better placed on the less plausible position, at least for a typical critical thinker on this issue, if not for this debate. If it just so happens that there is a large set of genotypic racial differences, but psychological differences are not among them, in spite of the many significant observed phenotypic psychological differences among races, then it would be a profound, unexplainable coincidence. As though God intelligently designed every race to be equal, and then an original sin corrupted some of them. But I think we all agree that nature does not conform to such ideological thinking. Thank you. I now allow my opponent to make his opening statement.
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're coming in great.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We should reject the resolution, and here's why. Science and Race, I'm going to call them SR, needs to address the following issues and my objections and responses in order to support the resolve. Remember, the resolve is human races are substantially genetically different from each other, and among these genotypic racial differences is average intelligence. Going with the resolve, I can just first point out that SR needs to fix the resolve so it doesn't beg the question. As it stands, it assumes that races are groups of people with specific genotypic similarities, and this is justified because the members of each group share specific genotypic similarities. Until he fixes this, it has as much force as saying the resolve sucks because the resolve sucks. Also, Science and Race hasn't addressed the issues that arise when using the scientific concept of race. Scientific dictionaries define race as, quote, a phenotypically or geographically distinctive subspecific group composed of individuals inhabiting a defined geographical and or ecological region and possessing characteristic phenotypic and gene frequencies that distinguish it from other groups. The number of racial groups that one wishes to recognize within a species is usually arbitrary, but suitable for the purposes under investigation. This is just one definition of race used in biology. A survey of the literature using the term race just makes the concept more opaque, more confusing. Sometimes race is defined with respect to ecology and ecology alone. Other times it's defined with respect to ecology and population and ancestry. These definitions do not identify any type of essential race in non-human animals because they're context dependent. Two populations can be a race in one context or multiple races in another context. It depends on the aims of the scientists. Remember, it depends on the purposes under investigation. But if Science and Race overcomes this, but even if he overcomes this issue, he still needs to show that biological races in humans do in fact exist. The consensus of biology is that there are no races in this biological sense. Another thing that Science and Race would need to fix to support the resolve is he needs to explain to us how his method of clustering, categorizing race is not completely arbitrary. Again, he's pointed to a select number of traits that are that you can cluster. But you could do that with any manner of traits. It depends on what context. We can go into this a lot more. We'll probably will when we do our discussion. It's just that the other thing is when you look at the specific things that Science and Race, wants to point out, it seems like using the race concepts that he's using are not nearly as accurate as using specific populations due to geographic due to geographic location and things like that. In virtue of what principle can science and race justify his biological race concept? Science and race hasn't explained this to us at all, besides giving us an arbitrary clustering concept. And he needs to explain it if he wants to support the result. Finally, science and race needs to demonstrate how his biological race concept maps onto folk race concepts. Otherwise, his claims about intelligence and I believe, not just intelligence, but other factors like promiscuity and crime rates and everything. Otherwise, his claims about those things and the agenda he promotes have no solid foundation. The data science and race uses to support his claims about IQ disparities between the races assumes our folk conceptions of race: Black, African American, white, Asian, etc. The many attempts to biologically identify groups of humans do not match these categories. For example, you could probably use Ernst Mayer's definition, and that won't match up to any type of essential concept of race. You can also use the utility of identifying geographical populations in biomedicine, and those geographical populations won't match up to our folk concepts of race. But that's what Abel is referring to when he's saying there are races that are more promiscuous. There are races that have higher IQ levels. So science and race's attempt to biologically ground racial concepts shouldn't be taken seriously if these issues remain. The inferences he wants to make about intelligence, poverty, crime, aggression, all of that are supposed to help him float agendas associated with alt-left. Thank you for pointing that out specifically. They're associated with floating those types of stances. But why should we allow science and race access to any type of scientific support for these inferences if his concept of race is question-begging, arbitrary, and fails to track to folk race concepts, which makes it completely useless in assessing differences in intelligence or promiscuity or any of the other psychological genetic differences he points to? Faulty argumentation with dubious evidence for support shouldn't lead us to accept the resolution. Appeals to explanatory power are rendered impotent by a non-biologically based concept that better explains our observations. So until science and race addresses all these issues, we should reject the resolution. And it seems like in his opening, science and race is fine with supporting race realism and not supporting race realism. But if he goes with the latter, then he doesn't float the resolution. He is committed to going with the former. And it seems like he wants to say that these psychological genetic differences are seen in Black populations, they're seen in white populations, they're seen in Asian populations. I don't think he wants to say that they're seen in this population, that population, all in Africa, because there's more genetic diversity in Africa versus the populations in Europe and Asia. Those don't track to our folk concepts of race. So I don't see how science and race can float the idea that race is grounded in biology if he's not even interested in supporting that claim. It's arbitrary. The resolution seems to beg the question, and there are better explanations for the phenomenon he wants to speak about. So that's my opening. I'm ready to go into the interaction, the discussion.
Oh, okay. So we're going to go into the about 30 to 40 minute discussion period, which starts now. You guys can go ahead. Oh, and science and race, if you could stop presenting so we can...
Or screen sharing, rather.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, like just having an open conversation.
Yeah,
where either person can speak.
He's saying that you're screen sharing the little your presentation from earlier. If you want to switch back to your webcam, that'd be great.
Oh, sure.
And if you want to go ahead and make the opening statements to the discussion portion, where you can have a little bit of a back and forth, since you are the affirmative, and Joe just presented his case. Go for it.
Oh, okay, sure. The claim was made that there is no consensus among biologists that there are races, or I think the claim was that there is consensus among biologists that human races don't exist. That claim would be true for American anthropologists. They're the ones who tend to claim that human races do not biologically exist, but I've noticed the opposite pattern among evolutionary biologists, including Ernst Mayr, including E.O. Wilson, Sewell Wright, and Richard Dawkins. Though, of course, there are some evolutionary biologists who oppose that position. I think Richard Lewontin would be one of them. And there is a reason for that. American anthropology is explicitly much more of an activist organization whose goal is to defend native peoples than it is a scientific organization, so much that many of them disregard the label of science or scientist for what they practice. But for evolutionary biologists, the concept of race is absolutely essential for their own theory, and there is no reason to think that the human species is a special exception. It takes only a minor pattern of difference between subsets of species for those subsets to be considered races.
What about the definition of race I gave, though? Like, instead of attacking what American anthropologists think, what about the definition I gave specifically?
I don't have any objection to the definition of race that you gave. It seemed good to me. I like it.
Well, the thing is that the consensus is that that definition, the biological concept of race, doesn't map with folk conceptions of race, the ones that I think you want to appeal to when you talk about differences in intelligence, promiscuity, that kind of thing. And it's also the case that the consensus of biologists, not just anthropologists, but biologists, think that race in that concept, with that concept, don't exist when you're talking about humans. If anything, race is better as a cultural construct. Culture construct.
It would be plausible to me if biologists generally disagreed with the claim that there are psychological genotypic differences among races. But
not races, amongst individuals in different or individual populations.
So you're saying that yes, there would be genotypic psychological differences among individuals, but not among races, and that's what they would generally.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that's plausible too. That they would generally believe that, but it's not plausible that biologists would disbelieve in biological races.
For humans.
For humans, biological human races, because the human species most plainly follows in that pattern, and no biologist needs to believe that there are psychological differences among races in order to accept the obvious reality that biological races do exist, because it would directly follow from the theory of evolution that biological human races must exist, and not just that they can, but they most certainly do.
Are you using?
I gave Ernst Mayr's definition of geographic race in my opening statement, and I think it matches yours.
No, mine speaks about ecology as well. And the other thing I pointed out is that there are several different concepts of biological race that are used in the literature when you're looking at non-human populations.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
I agree. Some of them are in terms of geographic boundaries. Others are in terms of morphological traits. Others are in terms of phylogeny. But they do tend to describe the same thing. And whatever biological definition that you prefer, that's what the human races would match that. So you also said that categorizing races is arbitrary, and that is somewhat true, and just because of the spectra of races, much like the way we divide colors on a color spectrum is arbitrary, but it certainly wouldn't follow that colors have no basis in physics. Much like colors objectively exist, so do human races.
Well, the one thing that I think it needs to be clear is that if you're going to say, look, we can divide up populations by clustering them, we can pick out differences or traits and use those to inform some sort of grouping pattern. The thing is, do those track to the folk concepts of race?
Yes, they do. Given such arbitrary divisions, the biological divisions of races map onto the cultural constructs of races about 99.8% of the time, per Tang et al. 2004, the study titled Genetic Structure, Self-Identified Race, Ethnicity, and Confounding In-Case Control Association Studies. So if you take 1,000 people and do a genetic test to decide their race, then that will match what race they say they are about 99.8% of the time. So there is most certainly a mapping between the folk concepts of race and biological races.
No, I mean, it seems to me like if you use a Rosenberg study, you can certainly pick some sort of like clustering system of race and pair that with the cultural concepts of race. But why is that picked to begin with? Is it only picked because it happens to match the culturally concept?
Yes, that could very well be. A society decides what divisions they find relevant. Maybe there is a slight division between one group and another group, but society doesn't make that division. They just cluster those two groups together. But it is nevertheless one of the many correct ways to divide races.
One of the many correct ways. I mean, the thing is, it's correct because it matches with a culturally constructed concept. If that's the case, then race realism doesn't work. We're only picking biological concepts that match with our concept of race based on socioeconomic self-identity implications, all that stuff. We're not using biology. We're using socially constructed concept of race and then seeing how biology configures into it.
I suppose you can think of it much like I said before, a color spectrum. There would be some ideas about colors, some very bad ideas about colors, but there would be many correct ways to think about colors. It'd be incorrect to say, for example, that pink is just a slight variation of the color blue. It's not. It's far away from the color blue and much closer to the color red on the color spectrum. In the same way, there are some incorrect ways to think about biological races. I think I may have told you before that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes that Native Americans are a subset of Jews, but of course they're not, because they would be far away, the Native Americans would be far away from Jews on any cluster analysis.
Consider Jews a race?
Any cluster of people would be a race. So they can be big, or they can be small. There can be just a few races, that like the three-year scheme of Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, or there could be, you can divide each of those three races into many subsets, and we can call those races too. I think that would follow from the theory of evolution. And we really have no choice. And it would nevertheless be the case that there are significant differences between the races biologically, and we had best make sense of them instead of wrongly inferring from the continuum fallacy that therefore races don't exist.
No, I think you're confusing the issue. No one's saying that you can't group populations, and in order to answer some sort of contextual issue, you can group it in order to answer issues with biomedicine, for example. You're grouping it in order to answer political issues, but you're doing that based on a socially constructed concept. So it's meaningful only with respect to parameters that aren't associated with race realism. The resolution, I can reject it. The resolution, it's that simple. Also, I'm not sure why you would say that Jews themselves are a race when you can have Jews in America as their own population, and you can have Jews wherever else in the world as their own population, and say that those are different races. You can have Ameri-Jew and Euro-Jew. Those are different races. You
got the Ashkenazi Jew, the Sephardic Jew.
Other than where do you draw the line other than saying that race is socially constructed? Because if you do that, then I can reject the resolution. We all can reject the resolution.
Yeah. Would you likewise say that colors are no more than social construction? You can see they are. I do agree with you in parts, but it would not follow that there's no biological difference between those social constructions, because it's a social construction of something that's biologically real. If we divide a continuum, then those divisions, wherever we put the lines and however many lines we draw, that's a social construction. But the continuum is objective reality, and that objective reality matters. And wherever we draw those lines and however many we draw, there would be objective differences between one and another. It's most certainly true for skin color. It's most certainly true for height. So a bunch of people who believe that races are merely social constructions would overinterpret that claim, a claim that I take to be misleading at best and not even wrong at worst. To believe that there's
identify the different populations that have any meaning. Without this social construct of race, you can identify which biological groups to, focus on.
Well, why not? Suppose that we were to... Said. I said what now?
You said that we use the social construction of race, and then we match the whatever geographical groupings of different populations to those socially constructed concepts of race.
Yeah, so suppose that our social constructs of race would be based on the people who self-identify on like census forms in America. You got whites, you got black, you got Asian, you got Native American, and each of those social constructs would have objective genetic differences with respect to average skin color, with respect to average height, with respect to frequency of purely genotypic diseases like cystic fibrosis. So yeah, let's say that these racial categories are social constructions. I'm fine with that. I can let you have that. But what you cannot say is that, therefore, psychological genotypic differences are therefore impossible. And I say, because I say, on the contrary, we have established fact of genotypic differences relating to everything else of the human body. Every system of the human body has genotypic racial differences. And we have phenotypic racial differences when it comes to psychology. So the claim, even if races are mere social constructs, whatever that means to you or anyone, the dissenting claim is highly implausible.
Okay, so I think I have three issues. Saying that race is a social construct isn't some crazy ambiguous statement. It's saying that sociopolitical processes and self-identity and other issues inform how we construct these different racial groups. It explains more when you're using a social concept of race. It certainly explains the different IQ disparities. I think it also explains a lot of biomedical concepts as well. The other thing is I'm not understanding why you keep forgetting that I am saying I have no problem with there being genetic differences between human beings. The issue is that doesn't track to these discrete concepts of race that you want to identify as being more or less promiscuous compared to other races. If it's the case that we could just look at different populations, we can have a whole bunch of different populations in Africa, for example, because there's significantly more genetic variation amongst African populations than the populations in the rest of the world due to evolution. Now, the other thing that I'm not clear on what you mean by psychological genotypic. What is it what does that mean when you say that?
That would mean psychological traits that have a genetic basis, a genetic component to the variations. So we know from heritability studies that intelligence, as measured by IQ tests, is about 70% heritable within groups, as in 70% of the variation away from the mean would be explained by genetic variance as opposed to environmental variance. Similar values exist for antisocial personality disorder, which feeds into criminality, and sexual promiscuity, and personality types such as extroversion. Those are all highly heritable genotypic psychological traits.
I don't understand. What is it? Atypical what disorder?
Antisocial personality disorder. That's
disorder.
That's what troublesome children have. So when criminals are children, they have antisocial personality disorder. That means they're kids that act like criminals.
All right. So let's go through IQ first, because I think that IQ is really, that is clearly better understood using the socially constructed concept of race. Mm-hmm. But I keep on forgetting, just to be clear, you're conceding the resolve. We can all reject it.
No, I'm not conceding the resolve, because if I presume that races are social constructions, then the resolve still follows, or at least the resolve can still follow. if races are if colors are social constructions, then there is still an average wavelength difference between each color.
Yeah, but it sounds like all you're saying with the resolve then is that people vary in terms of genetics. Therefore, people vary in terms of genetics. You're saying something that's trivially true, and doesn't map with any conception of race realism that I'm aware of, and it certainly doesn't map with the concepts of. I mean,
I disagree, because we can make other.
Race. Go ahead.
We can make other socially constructed groups that would not have average differences of such traits. If we were to group all the even-numbered people in terms of where they live at their address, the even-numbered addresses versus the odd-numbered addresses, then chances are they have exactly the same IQ, they have exactly the same criminal behavior, exactly the same frequency of whatever genotypic disease, and so on. That's a social construction that's in which the genotypic differences simply don't exist. But for races, they most certainly do exist.
Why does social construction mean that you can't talk about genotypic differences? I don't see how that follows.
You're perfectly correct. Even if we have these socially constructed categories, there are most certainly genotypic differences. But some socially constructed categories would not have such genotypic differences, like between even and odd-numbered address livers. But it is true for races. They do have those genotypic differences. Even if those racial categories are socially constructed, the genotypic differences still follow.
But it's not true in virtue of biology.
No, it is true in virtue of biology. It follows from biology.
In virtue of the biological differences that map with the social construction of race. You're just picking out. You're picking out from the spectrum things that match to something that we have decided defines what race is. So if it's a case, like you said, you can have other socially constructed concepts of race, but you're picking out the most prominent ones. It's completely arbitrary, and so I don't see how you're not descending.
It's somewhat arbitrary, not completely arbitrary, because our social ideas, our arbitrary ideas about race follow from the objective realities of biology, the objective realities of genetic differences. It's very... Our social constructs of race follow very closely from biological realities about race. We typically think of races in terms of tendencies of one's ancestors, about where the ancestors tended to live. So when we think of an African race, we don't think about where they live currently, we think of where their ancestors lived 10,000 years ago.
Why 10,000 years?
Because that was before the migrations were most common. So like 500 years ago, Europeans emigrated all over the world. But 10,000 years ago, people of the white race lived in Europe.
No, migration is a hallmark of human evolution. Migration out of Africa as Homo sapiens is a huge deal.
But it's only in recent times
that 10,000
migration. It's only in recent times that migration has sped up, and it takes a long time for genetics to catch up to migrations, although it does happen.
What are you picking like this? You're just saying because it's faster?
Yeah, it makes a little more sense to think of races in terms of what the ancestors tended to be instead of where people currently live right now. Because I may live in the same house as a black man, but there is a pattern of genetic differences in which he would tend to match the alleles common among Black Africans, and I would tend to match the alleles common among Europeans.
But the thing is that when you have people self-identify, like in the thing that you mentioned, the paper that you mentioned, you're going to have people identifying as Black Americans, but you can subdivide the population of Black Americans into different groups that originated from Africa.
That's right.
They were brought over like a lot more recently. It wasn't really the greatest type of migration, but they were brought over here, and then they were generalized or they were generalized into Black Americans. But that's right. Still something that that people will identify with because of the sociocultural implications that come about. And if it's a case that people identify with respect to races, and what they mean by race is the population that they originated from in Africa, for example, for Black Americans, then they wouldn't identify as just Black Americans. They would identify as, sub-Saharan African Americans. They would identify as those concepts. Those concepts would be able to track to the concepts of race that I think you are using when you want to divide up people in terms of IQ disparity, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's no doubt. So that's both the present living place and the place of one's ancestors are important for one's identity, including racial identity. I don't really have any disagreement.
Yeah, but the thing is that it's clearly the case that a social construct of race better explains the phenomenon we see. It better explains the biological phenomenon that we see. Again, we would have to reject the resolution if you want race realism to hold.
Well, that doesn't follow, because I can agree with you that if races are merely social constructions, then the biological differences still exist. And yeah, maybe if you say, if we have like a model of races being social constructions, which I would have to concede is at least part true, then that better explains. It would be like a combination of an explanation that combines cultural norms with the biological science. That's probably the best way to go.
If America didn't have slavery, would there still be Black Americans?
Maybe a few, if Black Africans voluntarily migrate. I believe that's what Barack Obama's father did.
Would they identify simply as African Americans, or would they identify as the different groups that they migrated from?
I expect their children would identify as African Americans. That seems plausible, at least.
Okay. So it seems like you're saying that any type of social construction matches up with any type of grouping pattern.
Yeah, there's a high level of correspondence.
But why is it the case that you're stopping at, I don't know, the only actual like race concepts you mentioned are the 3 race concepts that's not used. It wasn't even used by Rosenberg. Are you saying, why is it that you picked, the reason why you picked African or Black or even Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, is because 10,000 years ago there was more migration. I don't understand why that point. Why not the point when we migrated out of Africa? It wasn't super fast, it wasn't super recent, but it was significant. Or why not the migration in the transatlantic slave trade?
So suppose we were to pick a point like 200,000 years ago before the migration out of Africa as the identifying concept of races, then we wouldn't be really telling the difference between Europeans and Africans, although there are most certainly differences that follow from the migrations out of Africa. There are alleles among Europeans and only Europeans, although I think there are a few populations in Africa that have it too, that have adult lactose tolerance, and that would follow from Europeans tending to raise cattle, and drinking milk was a way for those Europeans to survive. So there are genetic differences that would follow from the migration out of Africa, and the populations on every continent in the world that tend to map very well to the social constructs that we tend to value. If we like, we can have a social construction that says we are all just one race, and there are differences, but no real important differences, and that's okay. I guess that'd be just another social construction. But
the thing is people usually just say
real quick.
Yeah.
I'll peek in and say that we have reached the 30-minute mark on the discussion. What I'd like for people to do moving forward is, Abel, if you can, I know that Joe is about to make a response. If you could make the response after I'm done, but Abel, if you want to kind of hammer home some of your final points, and then before we move on to the closing statements, because Abel had like about a minute and a half to make his opening statement in the discussion, I'd like for Joe to be able to say, give about a minute, maybe less, saying what he kind of wants to hear addressed in Abel's closing statement before we move on to that. So as you were, we'll be moving on to that status in about, maybe about 8 minutes or so, maybe less. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I never actually got to any of my direct arguments. This seems to be a lot shorter debate than I expected. Do I even have time to present my direct arguments in favor of the resolution?
No, that was the point in time for your, opening statements. But this is kind of a discussion period where you guys kind of go back and forth questioning stuff. I think that Joe has been kind of holding up to the dissent by asking questions about your position before making closing statements. But I think that Joe is about to make a statement, and then I guess, Abel, if you want to make your responses after that, go ahead.
Well, I'm not really sure what else to say, because I guess I expected that I'd have more time to. I didn't exactly keep track of the time so well, but I guess I could just.
Go ahead, Joe.
We could totally do more after we do our closing. I mean, it's not like, okay, we have to, right? So don't worry too much about that. I mean,
there's going to be an after hangout. You guys can talk more.
Yeah.
It's no problem.
So don't worry about that. Because I have responses to the IQ thing, but I didn't. Circumstances changed a lot. So continue. Yes. Sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
I guess I would like to emphasize that even if races are social constructions, whatever that means, there are still most certainly a large set of genotypic differences. And since there are phenotypic psychological differences, then it's very plausible. And I expect it would be very difficult to claim that psychological genotypic differences between these socially constructed races don't exist. That's a very difficult claim to make, given so many other genotypic differences between the races. We would like to think that all races are equal, because then it would be easiest to solve without much moral quandaries. But the reality, the actual reality, seems to be more difficult, and I think that we should not let the alt-right monopolize this science, or else when this science becomes proved with beyond all doubts within the next 10 years, because the National Institute of Health is gathering the genomes of 1 million peoples, and they'll be identifying the alleles that code for educational attainment, it would prove the alt-right's correct beyond reasonable doubt, and they would plant their flag in it and say we were right all along, and therefore let's wage war against blacks and Jews, and the left would be like stuck in an incoherent ideology that's anti-science.
I'm not sure what you're really addressing, because none of this stuff is related to anything I brought up in the debate.
Well,
yeah, I know. I'm just making my own points.
Before we, I guess all parties being interested in having a more fleshed out conversation, I think that maybe we can say that we can kind of agree to disagree on the issues about the definition of race that we've been talking about, and perhaps move on to the IQ conversation that I know that Joe is interested in having and says he's prepared for, and I know that Abel definitely wants to talk more about, because it has a lot to do with the resolve. So
Yes.
if you want to, you talked a little bit about it in your opening statement about the IQ differences.
Yes,
Joe,
sir.
do you have any responses to what he has said is about IQ, or Abel, do you have any
I think you would have
major
to
point you want to highlight?
I think you would have to flesh it out more. Like, I'm not sure exactly what he's saying.
So the average IQ among races is different for many different racial groups. The average IQ of whites is defined. That's how IQ is defined. It's standardized at 100 with a standard deviation of 15. All racial groups have a standard deviation of 15, meaning that's only like 63% are within the range of minus 15 to plus 15, about the mean. But Black Americans have an average IQ of 85, a standard deviation below whites. And this is very likely due to the genotypic difference. Asian Americans, who tend to be people who descended from Japan, Korea, and China, have an average IQ of about 105, a slight advantage over whites. And
In America,
America, if you were to go to Southeast Asia, then their average IQ would tend to be lower. And each racial group likewise has their own averages. Ashkenazi Jews have the highest IQ of any racial group at about 110. Which,
before you catalog all the different groups that you can identify their IQs with different IQ ranges, I want to address a specific point you mentioned. Asians in America have higher IQs, but if you actually go to the IQ levels in their countries of origin, they have lower IQs. I think that points more to like a socioeconomic or even like national identity explanation for the disparity in IQs, not any type of genotypic foundation, because they're both Asian people, but one group is in America, the other group is, in Asia.
I think at one point I heard that China had an average IQ of 100, but I don't know the source of that. Other sources have claimed 105, but in Japan and South Korea, it's been somewhat consistent that they really do have an average IQ of 105, and in Singapore and it's even higher, about 108, I believe.
Are you identifying like Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and like
both Native Japanese and Japanese Americans have an average IQ of 105?
It's not just Asian Americans. You actually differentiated between them, because we could stratify within the concept of people being white. We could stratify which group, like is which white group is the smartest white group. I believe like Russians or something have the highest IQ, and the Irish have the lowest IQ when you stratify intelligence in terms of IQ in the white population.
Yeah, so you can make subdivisions among those races. I'd say that the lowest IQ white group would be the Roma. I think it's somewhere between 70 and 80, and the highest white IQ I would count as the Ashkenazi Jews. They're Jews, however, they're 80% white, so I think that counts as white.
Earlier you said that Jews are their own race. Now they're a part of the
That's true. They're their own race. That's part of the Ashkenazi Jews are part of the Jewish race, and the Jewish race is part of the Mediterranean race. Except I would actually there's an intermediate there. So the Ashkenazi Jews are 80% white, so they're 80% European descent and 20% Jewish. And Jews in turn are Mediterranean are the Caucasoid race. Yeah, so yeah, there's you can make all kinds of subdivisions, and many of them can be fine. Like the African pygmies, they're very short because of their geographic descent, and that you can define that as a race too. You can define races. You can divide races all the way down to the individual because of the theory of evolution, and that shouldn't throw us off and make us think that races are therefore meaningless any no more than like I said, colors. You can
maybe I should clarify this now. I don't think that the concept of race is meaningless. I think that you can't ground the concept of race biologically, and it seems like you agree with that.
Yeah, same point. Maybe you don't think it's meaningless, but I have the same points against the claim that you can't ground it in biology. You most certainly can ground it in biology, because the biology would be a spectrum. So there are no objective, discrete racial categories in biology, but the spectra exists, and we can divide the spectra into meaningful categories.
So you're just saying that genetic variation is race?
Races are groups that have varying allele frequencies.
So there is a discrete concept that you're appealing to. It's not just genetic. It's not just a continuum. If I were to talk about differences among colors, then it would be the same way. I would need to be talking in terms of discrete color categories, but that would not imply that those categories are anything but spectral in the objective reality. Yeah, but it's us who decides whether or not, this is what we're going to officially call red. This is what we're going to officially call blue. This is cyan. This is whatever. The point is that it's picked by us humans. So the same thing, we're picking from biology to incorporate in our socially constructed concept of race. And the thing is that I don't see why that's becoming an issue, because I also think I earlier demonstrated that this socially constructed concept of race better explains the IQ disparities.
So how does the social construct of race explain IQ differences?
Well, I mean, the reason why Asians from Asia have lower IQs compared to Asians in America is access to different resources, different educational systems.
But that follows from other points aside from the social construction of the social construction of races would be a tangent to that newer point. It doesn't. I don't think you can really explain anything with the belief that races are social constructions.
I just did. I don't. What's the? Go on with why is it a tangent? What are the points that it's tangential from? What's really explaining this disparity in IQ between two groups that we would call the same race, but just located in different geographic locations?
So there are many genotypic racial differences that would, of course, would be impossible to explain with the thought that races are social constructions. Like there is 10 times the rate of cystic fibrosis among whites of European descent than among Black Americans.
Are we moving on from IQ?
I was going to point out that we're getting back to the social construction conversation and away from the distinct differences that you were wanting to point out between races. I think it's clear.
No, the issue is that I think the socially constructed concept of race explains more. It explains all the stuff that science and race wants to explain. And so we're talking about, I mean, I'm trying to talk about IQ. Now I think we're moving on to biomedicine. But we're talking about the topics that you mentioned earlier, Ocean, that you want us to tackle. It's just that I keep on having to hammer home the idea that the socially constructed concept of race clearly explains the disparity in IQ, for example. A lot
social
more
construction of races. It's non-specific, and it can explain if it can explain IQ differences, then it can explain absolutely any concepts related to race that you can possibly imagine. It would be able to explain why the IQs are equal. It doesn't, but it does. That's not explanatory power. That's just something follows from perfect ambiguity. There's no explanation there.
Okay, I didn't just explain why the IQs would be the same. I explained why the IQs are different between Asian populations in Asia and Asian American populations. That could be explained by appealing to social concepts, cultural concepts, access to resources, political aims, whatever, that kind of thing. It doesn't seem to me, it seems to me like if it was going to be explained by any biological concept of race, they would both have the same IQ.
If there are biological differences between races, and if psychology is a function of biology and psychological variations are a function of biological variations, then we could not possibly expect anything else but intelligence differences between races.
No, it's within the Asian race that you're talking about, the differences.
Yeah. It's between races among Asians, and it's between Asians and Europeans, and so on.
I'm not
So
sure.
I'm going to pop in again and say let's go. We're entering the 15-minute mark, and I want to cap. Go ahead and cap.
I mean, do you want to just have the closing?
About an hour. Is everybody okay with moving on to that now?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay. All right, cool. Joe, if you can make like a kind of a minute statement.
We're just doing
saying what you'd like to hear,
right?
And then
I mean,
yeah, this is getting closing statements.
No, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying.
Yeah. And then we can move to the 5-minute closings.
Okay, I want you to explain to me how matching the biological differences that are clearly amongst the populations around the world with our socially constructed concept of race isn't rejecting the resolve and supporting the claim that race is socially constructed. I also am not sure why it is that when we talk about which populations to decide would represent races, we would pick 10,000 years ago, the migratory patterns 10,000 years ago. I don't see how the speed of migration is important to any type of biological concept of race. I guess that's kind of, I mean, I guess those issues ring true. I also want to hear an explanation for why is it the case that members of the same race but in different populations, one in America, one in Asia, why it is that instead of having the same IQ no matter where they're found, why one has a higher IQ versus the other having the lower IQ. It's the same race. Why is it the case that there is this difference? If we're using IQ to represent intelligence, and we're using intelligence as a genotypic trait that we would use to like differentiate between the groups, then
Wrap it up.
It would be the case that Asians would all have the same IQ no matter where they would be. Otherwise, it's not a meaningful thing to bring up as a characteristic to define Asians.
Okay, so
All right,
I
let's
don't-
go on to closing statements. And Joe, if you can take over, or not Joe. Sorry,
okay. Well,
you have to take over. I'm entering that minute closing statements.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Abe.
I shared my screen. I hope you can see that table that I have
Roger.
titled Combined Hierarchy. And it's my basis for claiming that there is not so much IQ variation when one race migrates to another country. There's some variation, but the hierarchy between those migrants within each nation tends to remain the same. This data is sourced from Richard Lynn's The Global Bell Curve. It's a meta-analysis of races within multiracial nations all over the world. So I guess I can agree that there is some IQ variation, at least some minor IQ variation, either because of environmental differences between the source nation and the new host nation, or because of swift like epigenetic changes. However, there really isn't that much difference, and so this is something that's the vague concept of races being mere social constructs would not predict. It doesn't predict anything, in my opinion. But if you were to claim that the psychological differences between races are nothing but environmental, this table here is something that you most certainly would not predict. You would predict mere randomness and chaos because people don't always carry their culture with them and pass them on to their children when they go from an old nation to a new nation. However, if the racial intelligence differences were mostly genotypic, this is what we expect because they pass on, the migrants pass on their genetic variants to their children even after they migrate. So I guess that's wraps up my argument here.
Okay. Joe, up to 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, I guess to directly answer what was just mentioned, I'm not really sure. I think you're going to have to go into more detail how to like assess this graph when we're like talking after the debate, I suppose. So I'm not really sure how to like how to assess what you're saying. The other thing is that if you look at, say, a mixed race, people who have both black and white genes, I suppose, and you're trying to identify, and you're saying, let me start over. If you're looking at people with white genes and black genes together. They're mixed race. And you're saying that the IQ is genetically grounded and that white people have a higher IQ than black people. Then what we would expect to see if your claims if the claims that IQ is genetically grounded, what we would expect to see is those mixed race individuals with more white genes compared to black genes scoring higher on IQ tests versus those with more black genes or an intermediate amount of black genes. But that's actually not what we see. So what would happen is the culturally constructed concept of race would expect to see the IQ scores being contingent upon parental guidance or how much different like education resources the child has access to. All of these sociocultural phenomenon. That's what you would expect to see. That's what you would use in order to describe the data that we see. The data we see is that mixed race students score with respect to socioeconomic class standing. For example, those mixed race adopted children with both white parents tended to score higher. And both white parents are usually associated with like certain socioeconomic standings. That's explained by the social construct of race. It's not explained by the genetic concept of race. So let's just catalog all the different things that were required of science and race in order to float the resolve. He had to show that the resolve wasn't question begging, and the best I think we got with that is to show that it's a tautology. It's trivially true that I guess people have genetic differences will have genetic differences. He also needed to at least establish its relation with the biological concept of race that's used to differentiate between non-human species, but I believe that was either unaddressed or it was conceded that we can use a different definition of race. So that's at least ambiguous. The other thing is he had to track this genotypic construct of race with our folk concepts of race. And as far as I could tell, it's actually the case that you establish the folk concept of race, a socially constructed concept of race, and then you pick out those genotypic traits that would cluster human populations around those concepts of race. So he's actually for the opposite contention. It seems like race realism isn't supported at all at this point. Finally, he had to deal with any of the IQ testing, the actual empirical evidence, and explanatory power of the socially constructed concept of race versus the biological concept of race. We didn't really touch upon that too much, so that's not a big deal. But a lot of the other stuff wasn't covered, so I don't think that the resolve can be supported whatsoever. I think that the resolve needs to be rejected, and that this concept of labeling yourself as science and race, maybe you should label yourself as science and a continuum of genetic variation across populations or something. Because I don't think that it really conveys an accurate depiction of the position that you're trying to support. And so that's the end. Thank you for debating.
Thank you too.
Real quick, I guess I want to thank both of you guys for being able to do this debate. I know this was difficult to schedule, and thanks to Tom for hosting.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. Science and race.
I think it was a good experience. And I think we can also have more debates like this in the future, and possibly doing kind of 3-on-3 or something like that with teams in the future.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you to both of you.
Yeah, thanks Science Race. Thanks Joe. Thanks Ocean for co-moderation and logistics, being a bro. Hope he's out of traffic soon. And so I'll send out I'll make a new hangout. Hopefully, I'd like to talk to your friend Jeff if he's around too, Science and Race. And some other people want to come in and talk, so you can just continue the conversation. But I'll start a new hangout and then this one.